What the Western world doesn't understand about the Russia-Ukraine war. Understanding the cause of the Russia-Ukraine war is the most important challenge for the global West. The reason for Russia's war against Ukraine is actually irrational. However, the roots of this irrationality are not fear, but hatred toward Ukraine and everything Ukrainian. Russia is willing to pay any price to destroy Ukraine. Neither material costs, nor human losses, nor global isolation will stop Russia. Russia would calmly accept the status of North Korea in order to destroy Ukraine. Russia understands the irrational nature of its war against Ukraine, and therefore tries to explain the roots of this irrationality through a sense of ownership. By imposing this sense on the world, Russia intends to overcome international law and recognized borders, as well as justify its claims on territories and the destruction of Ukrainian identity. The concept of ownership is the most disorienting for the Western world when trying to understand the Russia-Ukraine war. It would be the biggest mistake to think that by own Russia only refers to Ukrainian territory. When Putin and his followers use the term own, they collectively perceive it as encompassing the people living in Ukraine. We are not talking about the familial feeling of the older, in quotes, Russian brother towards the younger, Ukrainian sister in Russian interpretation, or Muscovite son towards Ukrainian mother in Ukrainian interpretation. It's about a belief that these parties belong to each other, in quotes, because they supposedly took an oath of eternal loyalty to each other. In Russia's view, Ukraine is an unfaithful wife, a wife who has betrayed. The history of this so-called faithfulness dates back to approximately 1654, when the Cossacks' top council, Ukrainian, took place in Pereyaslav, city close to Kiev. Here, the hetman, head of the Ukrainian Cossack state known as Hetmanshchina, Bohdan Khmelnytsky, along with his general officers and military leaders, voted for Ukraine's transfer under the jurisdiction of the Moscow Tsar. The Pereyaslav Council concluded with a joint ceremonial pledge of allegiance. Present-day Russian political elites interpret this event as a pledge of allegiance by the Ukrainian, back then Ruthenian people to be faithful, and remain with Russians, back then Muscovites, until death. Ukraine, to the contrary, considers that mid-17th century union between Ruthenia, Ukraine, and Muscovy, Russia, not as an oath akin to a marriage, but a trivial military alliance. The Pereyaslav Agreement was in fact more than just a simple military alliance. It represented a military and political unity between Ruthenia, Ukraine, and Muscovy, Russia. The driving force behind this union was the dominance of religious identity over national identity. Catholic Poland and Orthodox Ruthenia were seen as incompatible for coexistence within the same union. Orthodox Muscovy, at the same time, was viewed as an acceptable partner for creating a shared cultural space. The initial perception of Moscow as a former colony of Kiev also played a role, despite significant transformation Moscow underwent during Mongol rule. It's important to understand that unlike Bulgarians, Ukrainians never considered Russians as liberators. Ukrainians fought the Poles independently, believing to contribute to the collapse of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and later, being for centuries in a military and political union with Russia, waged numerous wars against Russia itself. So, while the Union existed, Ukrainians fought against Russians within the Union framework. History has seen many military and political alliances, confederacies, and unions, but it's really difficult to find examples of alliances that formed such uniquely irrational and intimate relationships between allies. Would it be rational to describe in such a manner the relationship between Turks and Armenians at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, which obviously led to the Armenian tragedy? Therefore, the interpretation of the Pereyaslav Treaty as a marriage in quotes, by present-day Russians, implying an obligation to live together in sickness and in health until death, deserves special attention. This unique interpretation of the military and political union by Moscow stems from a desire to bind forever, to assert its primacy. Such behavior is driven by a subconscious sense of deep-seated inferiority and perceived secondary status. The political inferiority of 17th-century Muscovy was supplemented by the spiritual and ethical inferiority, which began to emerge from the mid-18th century onwards. Despite the annexation of the Kiev metropolis by the Moscow Patriarchate in 1685, Kievan church representatives Theophan Prokopovich and Stefan Yavorsky became the chief visionaries for the European transformation of the Tsardom of Russia. Ukraine was, and continues to be, the main source of empathy and the foundation of ethics for non-European Russian people. The ongoing war is a subconscious reaction of the Russian people to the loss of moral guidelines. The longer Russia remains without a source of empathy and ethics, the more its immoral essence becomes apparent. The realization by Russian elites that Russia is being declassified as the country delegated by the West to civilize, in quotes, the wild, in quotes, Ukrainians only irritates Russians further. To this day, a considerable portion of Western elites still believe that Russians fulfill a cultural mission for agrarian nations. The nature of the union between two peoples who never had a classic colonial relationship and who permanently fought among themselves within the union framework remains incomprehensible, the real mystery for the West. To understand this phenomenon, one must grasp the metaphysical aspects of Western civilization and the political norms of the time. Up until the 19th century, Western civilization viewed government as sacred, with political leaders seen as God's representatives on earth. After the fall of Constantinople, the legitimacy of political power in Christianity was primarily ensured by the Vatican. Political leaders were perceived by European nations as God's representative on earth, and they were true believers. Ukrainians, however, didn't believe in God's representatives on earth, were skeptical about the ideas of vertical ties and universal mental chimeras, gravitating instead towards horizontal relationships. This Ukrainian phenomenon has obtained a scientific name, the desacralization of elites, and is well described in the Ukrainian proverb, "Where there are two Ukrainians, there are three hetmans," or three political parties. In modern terms, one might call Ukrainians the postmodern nation, but postmodernity never arrived in Ukraine. It has always existed within its present-day territory. That's why attempts to gain legitimacy from the Pope by receiving a crown, or to seize power by self-proclaiming oneself a king, were not just senseless to Ukrainians, they were dangerous. Military democracy and the institution of hetmanship were innate instruments for structuring society and building social hierarchy. But in the eyes of civilized, in quotes, society, hetman was an unsanctified and illegitimate political figure, a kind of field commander. In the mid-17th century, no other idea on how to overcome contradictions between European norms of the time and the metaphysical needs of the Ukrainian people was conceived than to get closer to Muscovy and borrow, in quotes, from them a foreign, yet at the same time own, in quotes, Russian Tsar for governance. This convergence at the elite level explains the very deep integration of ethnic Ukrainians into the highest echelons of political power in 18th and 19th century Russia and the USSR. And this is the explanation for the presence in Ukraine of elite industrial sectors, such as nuclear power or rocket science, and participation of Ukrainians in space programs. Russians are incapable of coexisting with other cultures, except through brutal absorption and eradication of those cultures. Some might say that any imperial nation can be accused of such behavior. But, firstly, such policies were practiced in the past and not by all empires. Secondly, no other nation, except Russians, treats cultures outside their imperial interest with such undisguised contempt and disrespect. Russian disdain extends even to other imperial cultures like Chinese or British. Hatred towards the different, especially when this difference is perceived as superior, is a hallmark of Russian behavior. The policy shifted from the open eradication of Ukrainian identity in the Russian Empire to a more disguised form of eradication in the USSR. The process of Russification was significantly accelerated through technological progress and modern media like radio and television. However, the primary reasons for the breakup were deep civilizational differences. Russian civilization is built on three pillars: criminalized will, mental chimeras, and the supremacy of the collective over the individual. Criminalized will refers to the suppression of acts of free will that stem from conscience. This doesn't mean that Russians lack willpower. The problem is their will is criminal in nature, because it doesn't stem from conscience. The material basis of this criminal will is rooted in hormones, neurons, synapses, etc. That's why support for war, murder, plunder is rewarded, while conscience that demands peace is punished by imprisonment. In Russian culture, democracy isn't about the delegation of authority, but about the delegation of conscience to an alpha male, the person capable of acting beyond the bounds of ethics and conscience. This doesn't mean that the alpha male's actions are inherently immoral, but that only he, in the Russian mind, can act morally and set the course for ethics. Thus, Russian elites can be both moral and immoral, while the common people, in the vast majority, are deeply immoral beings. Mental chimeras are vertical ideas created by the elites as objects of faith. The bright communist future, heavenly kingdom, Ruski Mir, Russian world, spiritual bonds, in quotes, grandeur, special mission, Russian soul, all these are mental chimeras that the weak-willed Russian soul follows. Mental chimeras are the source of ethics in Russian civilization. This is why the word morality in Russian, nravstvenost, has a unique equivalent derived from nrav, the rule set by the alpha male's temper. And this is why the Ukrainian word for conscience, sumlinia, which implies hesitation, doubt, has a fundamentally different meaning from the Russian word for conscience. Sovest, knowledge, information. For Ukrainians, the source of ethics is conscience, supremacy of the collective. Delegation of conscience by the individual requires constant monitoring by the collective all-seeing eye, in quotes, public censure that monitors and will definitely punish. This is why the word community illustrates the contrasting societal views between Ukraine and Russia, where hromada in Ukrainian refers to a community bound by shared values and mutual respect, and the Russian term община connotes a more oppressive, collectivist control. This difference is starkly evident in the behavior of a Russian soldier, who commits atrocities with impunity outside the reach of the collective all-seeing eye of public scrutiny. Since finding himself facing temptation, he doesn't apply conscience. He delegates his morality to the superiors. If the collective condones rape or murder, the individual will carry out these acts without hesitation. At the heart of Russian thought is the belief that human nature is deeply immoral. This is not just about the prevalence of evil over good in humans. The human being, in the Russian perspective, consists exclusively of evil. The demand to correct human nature isn't enough. It has to be broken. This is why there is no place in Russian ethics for such basic natural need as a sense of ownership, and there never was and never will be the right to property in Russia. Soviet collective farms, kolkhozes, aren't just about expropriation of harvest, which can be compared with the removal of a child from its mother for the state's needs. It's a destruction of a human life by the expropriation of means of production and land, which can be compared with the removal of a mother's reproductive organs, and raising a child for the implementation of necessary, right, in quotes, ideas. Ukraine is not a victim in the Russia-Ukraine war. It stands as an equal party in this conflict. For some, Ukraine represents the side of good, for others, evil. In many ways, Russia is Kyiv's ugly child. Ukrainians, to a certain extent, feel responsible for their creation, which was flawed from the beginning. For Ukrainians, war with Russia was inevitable. This is the reason we didn't panic when the world warned us of an impending attack. When the invasion came, we met it with composure and readiness, even forced President Zelensky, who initially gravitated toward negotiation with the enemy, to take up the fight. The truth is that Ukrainians are a nation unafraid of battle, especially against Russia. For many around the world, war with Russia seems like sheer madness, the reason why some believed Ukraine would fall within 3 days. But nuclear threats, or any other form of intimidation, will not deter us. Our mission is clear: to correct the historical mistake, or face death trying. We are not fighting merely for territorial integrity or the right to live. These are battles even animals engage in. We are not waging war for the West's security or to safeguard someone else's freedoms, as the West already enjoys an abundance of liberty. Nor are we fighting for the mere opportunity to be free. What we are fighting for is something much more profound: the right to be strong-willed. A strong-willed person acts and speaks according to what is necessary, driven by the demands of their conscience. A free person, on the other hand, follows what the body desires and what the mind suggests. For the strong-willed, conscience is the source of ethics, whereas for the free person, ethics stem from mental constructs or chimeras. This is not to say that Ukrainians do not need people, land, freedom, or international law. It simply means that these things must be achieved because they are right and necessary, not just because we desire them.